Hi everyone, welcome to Talks in Chinese Humanities. Before we start today, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded land on which I am working today, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and Bunurong peoples, and I'd like to pay respect to elders past and present. My name is Minerva Inwald. I'm an assistant lecturer in Chinese history at the University of Melbourne. Thanks for joining us for the talk today, which is co-presented by the Australian Society for Asian Humanities, the China Studies Centre, the Discipline of Chinese Studies, and the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre, all based at the University of Sydney. So I'll now hand over to my colleague Josh Stenberg to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you so much, Minerva. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be able to introduce Yingxin Shou. I will first, Yingxin Shou is a senior lecturer at ANU School of Culture, History, and Languages Department of Gender, Media, and Cultural Studies, and Deputy Director of ANU Malaysia Institute at the College of Asia and the Pacific. She currently holds an Australian Research Council Discovery Early Career Research Award, and we are very excited to hear about how that research is coming along. I think this is new research, so I think that I'm really excited personally, as you can tell. I think Yingxin will leave some time for question and answer at the end, so you can pop in any questions you may have in the Q&A. And without further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Shou herself.
Thank you, Josh and Minerva, and thank you, China Studies Center from University of Sydney for having me. And first, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where on which I live and work and think, which is the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I pay respect to the elders, past, present, and the emerging. And so I am going to talk about Cold War literary cultures in Malaya through Sinophone Periodicals from the 40s to late 60s. So this is part of a bigger project on Sinophone print culture in Malaya. And this particular section on periodicals was an outcome of the past 6 months or so not the past 6 months, but from July last year, I was in Singapore National Library as a fellow, trying to explore all this archive that they have, amazing magazines that they have in Singapore, not only National Library and NUS Chinese Library. So this is part of the outcome from that fellowship, and I thank the librarians and colleagues at NUS Chinese Studies from helping me with getting these materials. So I think I'll just start. I'll speak for about 30 to 40 minutes and then save some time for discussion. So because this is still a work in progress, so any feedback, questions, comments, suggestions are definitely very much welcome. So let me try to do my PowerPoint. I'll start with the question of why literary magazines, because I feel like literary magazines are quite often understudied in literary and culture studies, because unlike single authored books or short stories collections, or literary magazines present a unique set of challenge for researchers, because they are a product of collaborative efforts, yet they are frequently fragmented, they are multivocal, there's no just one single voice, and they are heterogeneous in genres. They, more often than not, they are also very short-lived. So some only has be able to put out one issue, a single issue, or two or three, and only for a few years. So they are kind of quite challenging to get those material in the first place, and then how do we really analyze them using different kind of approaches. Right. So, but I think what makes this publication particularly fascinating is not just their textual content, but also their visual aesthetics. As you can see from the picture on the left, there are many visual striking features that worth our attention. And also the material aspects of their production, circulation, and reception. which I will get into later. So for in post-war Malaya, for instance, the Chinese literary magazines were often driven by young people, mostly students, who played a central role in their creation and production. So through their voices, these magazines become powerful platforms for debating ideas, for change, and envisioning new forms of society, reflecting the perspective and aspiration that accompany the emergence of a new social group, which I think is the educated youth in Malaya. So although some of these magazines were sponsored by newspaper presses, a significant number of them were independently published, so relying on grassroots efforts rather than institutional backing. And this independence granted them greater freedom in curating their content, as they are not bound by institutional demands, demands from the bosses in newspaper, for example. However, it also subjected them to greater scrutiny by the colonial government in Malaya during that time, especially after the declaration of the Malayan Emergency in 1948. Because this periodical publishers, they were all required to obtain permits to operate, and then many of them were banned or shut down quickly because of the content. So from the end of the Second World War in 1945 to late 1960s, newspapers and magazines experienced a significant boom in Malaya. So in literary sphere, so we saw kind of two types of literary magazines. One is the general magazines like 综合性杂志, which roughly have they were kind of general interest publications, but also included a literature section, about 10 to 15% of them. And then we have another category, which is the pure literary magazines, the 纯文艺杂志, which was entirely devoted to literary pursuits. So in this project, I examine both types of publication, but with a particular emphasis on the later. So I have three questions for this research project. First, it's a general one. What were the competing ideas, recurring themes, and publishing trends evident in these magazines? The second, in what ways do these publications reveal the dynamics of culture networks in Malaya during the Cold War? And thirdly, how should the value of literary magazines be contextualized within the study of Mahua literary history, Malaysian Chinese literary history? So I'll first show you some numbers because I managed to collect that kind of compile the data of about 150 magazines published between 45 to 69. Half of them were the pure literary magazines, and half of them were the general interest periodicals. So these are not comprehensive due to gaps in available data and archival materials. So the first graph that you can see, it's an overview of the publications, which indicates their place of publication. Sorry, I don't have English translation for the titles because it's a lot of work. And these are the place of publication. You can see Singapore is still the center. It was a center of Sinophone Periodical publishing during this period. In fact, not just Chinese periodicals, but also Malay publications were also having Singapore as the center. And there was a marked increase in publication activities significantly after, immediately after the war. And this is the general magazine, yeah? So the most extensively circulated titles were the Saturday Review, which is a magazine published by Nanyang Shangpao. So this is for, oh, my apologies, this is not just general magazine, this is all categories. Some mistakes over here. So this is general and literary magazines. But for the interest of this talk, I'll just quickly go to this pure literary magazine, which is kind of our focus here. So this is specifically on the pure literary magazines. So we can see the search of publications in 1954, and then again in kind of early 60s and then mid 60s. So I'll explain the phenomenon later. And we can see they started to have some other interesting place of publications like Ipoh, Penang, or Mahua, for example. And then among all these publications, one magazine stands out as the longest running literary magazines, which is Jiao Feng Chao Fun. It continues to publish until today, and then it managed to publish the most issues. So I'll get to Jiao Feng later. So later in the second part of this presentation, I'll give you like a historical overview of this of these publications and give you some brief idea of what they are. So I'll start with Malayan Spring, which is the immediate post-war period from about 1945. It was a time when the writer Han Suying termed as the Malayan Spring, referring to the golden age of Mahua or Malayan Chinese literature in that period from 45 to 48, because according to her estimate, in just these 3 years, there were a total of 14 poetry collections, 96 novels, 48 essays collections, and 10 plays. They were published in Chinese. So this period also witnessed the rapid rise of radical newspapers and magazines, which flourished until the declaration of the Malayan Emergency. So unlike books, these periodicals or magazines, they could be produced and distributed more quickly and becoming vital platforms for exchange of critical ideas and public debate. So one of the earliest post-war literary magazines, it's called Southern Literature. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the cover. It's called Nanfang Wenyi, which was published on the 1st of December, 1945 in Singapore. So it proclaimed itself as the only pure literary periodical in Malaya, Malaya 唯一纯文艺刊物. Yet it managed to produce only a single issue, which is this one. So despite its brief existence, Southern literature features contributions from writers who would later go on to become significant figures in the history of Mahua literature, these writers. So the periodical is distinctively leftist in its orientation, so as evidenced by its inclusion of an essay advocating for literature grounded in the principles of new democracy. As you can see here, 现阶段的新民主主义文学论. So it talks about new democracy, which is, as you all know, rooted in Maoist ideology and was introduced in the early 40s. So this concept had gained considerable traction among Chinese intellectuals in Malaya during that time. And also another interesting aspect is another interesting essay of this is this section called Introducing Literature of the Oppressed Nations, 弱小民族文学介绍, which spotlighted a renowned Indonesian writer, Armin Pane, who was from Indonesian's generations of 1945. So this article included an excerpt of translation of his work by a leftist intellectual called Jing Ding, affiliated with China Democratic League, a CDL in Singapore, Wang Jingding, who had fled to Indonesia during the war. So this inclusion underscores Mahua literary scene's early engagement with and their concern for the literatures of neighboring third world nations, reflecting a broader sense of solidarity with anti-colonial movements during that time. But it managed to only publish one issue. And then this one, it's the general interest magazines, but also has, they both of them have literary section. So publishers and the editors of Fengxia and Xinfu New Women, they were also from China Democratic League, CDL. Hu Yuzhi, the husband, published Fengxia, and the wife, Shen Zijiu, published Xinfu. So for Fengxia, it's a current affairs magazine, a weekly magazine, and then it was praised by the British colonial officer Victor Purcell as far above any far above the level of any Chinese journalism we have had before in Malaya. And then Xingfu is the kind of the women's wing of this publication. And both magazines were bestsellers of their time, and they carry literary sections, as I mentioned. In fact, Fengxia became the platform for one of the most significant literary debates in the history of Mahua literature in 47 and 48, which is the question of the uniqueness of Mahua literature. The polemic kind of centered on whether writers should focus on the here and now in Malaya, writing about local realities, or should they continue to draw inspiration from China in their works. So that debate established Mahua literature as a distinct field, separate from Chinese literature in China. And so for New Women Monthly, I've written a journal article on it already. If you're interested, it was also a short-lived magazine from 45 to 48, only published about 28 issues. It was a great platform for women's writing on all aspects of their lives, domestic, social, political, intellectual, and literary. So because as we know, these two magazines, they were left wing kind of magazines, the commentary pieces are usually highly political and moralistic. But for women magazine, the New Women, they use the literary section or the letterbox section to depict their own perceptions of being women in Malaya. So it was an important women magazine, but I won't go into detail. But one thing I want to note is that these kind of abundance of literary activity was abruptly cut short with the Malayan Emergency, as the magazine ceased publication just a few months later, these two magazines and many others. And during the emergency, the radicals, the leftists were targeted by the colonial authorities, and many intellectuals and activists they were either deported or choosing to leave for China. And these two editors, they also kind of went back to China. So these magazines also kind of disappeared from the scene. So as we can see, from 48 to 40, from 45 to 48 was the Malayan Spring, because there was all this abundance of literary activities and publication. So what happened during the Malayan Emergency? And one literary historian, Fang Xiu, said that the literary landscape entered a period of hibernation, like 冬眠期 for Mahua literature, because very, very few magazines were published, and those that emerged, they largely avoided political discourse, right? So this is the only literary magazine that play a big role was the literary procession, 文艺行列, which was founded in 1950 by an author called Yao Zi, who was at that time a staff editor at Nanyang Xiangbao, the newspaper. And so the magazine itself was sponsored by the newspaper. As you can see, it's from Nanyang Xiangbao, Faxing, it's from Singapore. So that also explains how it managed to be published, because it has this institutional backing. So the first issue of this magazine doesn't have any opening statement, unlike many other magazines, which is quite unusual. So it included this kind of a metaphorical essay titled Quo Vadis. And this is the other pen name of the editor. So the piece kind of drew on the story of St. Peter's decision to return to Rome during the emperor's persecution of Christians, using it as an allegory to reflect on the two paths available to writers during the emergency. One is to retreat from reality, and the other was to confront the suffering of the people, right? So kind of being written in a really kind of a metaphorical way. So as you can see, there was the climate during that time, and during the repressive Malayan Emergency, so people cannot say something politically in an explicit way. But things changed after 1953, as I mentioned in the graph. So there was kind of a spike of search of publication in about 1954. And it experienced a revival in 1953 to 54, driven by this anti-yellow culture movement in Singapore. So it was a significant social and cultural campaign initiated by a large group of Chinese middle school students in Singapore in October in 1953. So the movement gained momentum as it received support from not just writers, activists, but also students, women's groups, and a lot of cultural workers as well. And they unite a broad coalition against what they perceive as the moral decay of society caused by Western colonialism. So the leaders of the anti-yellow culture movement blend the prevalent of what they call the decadent Western influence pornographic materials in the market, and the rise of mosquito presses and tabloid and newspapers. And this publication they think that this publication had flourished because of the emergency regulations, which banned the so-called healthy or serious magazines for their communist content. So the catalyst of the movement was a brutal rape and murder of a young student called Chong Yue-ting. And so that crime kind of ignited a widespread public outrage in Singapore. So the movement itself sought to counteract the trend of this Western influence materials by promoting socially responsible literature and publications. So it kind of, they push for moral and cultural renewal. So, and then we saw this, the emergence of several important left-leaning student-led literary magazines in Singapore. Those are mostly driven by students from the Chinese medium schools in Singapore. Some of you might know, in 1954, there was a strong student movement, protest in Singapore. So that also helped with bring out all these publications. And at least 4 of them that are listed here, as you can see, their publication period are quite short because they were banned, 9 months, 11 months, 20 months, and 19 months. So among the 4 student magazines, Renjian had the longest run, lasting 20 months and producing 25 issues. So the founding member is a writer called Liu Shun. He recalled this period with, of course, fondness, and say this was our collective effort. And I like this paragraph that he said. There's a warm and bustling atmosphere, gathered enthusiastic young individuals. How each member ended up at our publishing house at Kim Kiat Len, or who invited them, was hardly ever questioned. Thanks to these ever-changing, self-motivated big kids, as soon as the finances loosened up, manuscripts arrived, people showed up, and in a short time, the work was ready for printing. So the terms 小青年大孩子, like young individuals and big kids, kind of aptly describe this group of students, youthful but mature, idealistic but determined to create significant, impactful work as part of their efforts to decolonize their homeland. So these magazines were also circulated beyond Singapore, which helped them forge connections with young writers across the Malay Peninsula and Borneo, and built lifelong friendships. So here we see how literary magazines function not only as the literary or textual platforms, but also as sites of labor. And when they come together to do this, and where the processes of writing, editing, and circulation help cultivate like-minded relationships and literary communities. And for editors of Renjian, one of the other editor, Ling Zhen, said that they had a very clear vision for their magazine's content. They aimed to produce works that were grounded in social realism and were highly critical of those not aligned with progressive political movements. So basically, they said that we insisted on realism or realistic works and reject anything strange or unconventional. From the very beginning, our stance was clear. At that time, the main focus was anti-colonialism. Some groups were quite conservative, like those in Taiwan, or 交锋. They were rather conservative, but I don't think he meant the writers in Taiwan, but the 交锋 writers who were influenced by Taiwan modernism. He said that they were rather conservative, so we separated from them. And 交锋, just to remind you again, was the longest running magazine that I showed just now. So you can see that some of this visual aspects from the magazine, they all kind of painted this themselves, or they asked for contributions from some other artists in Singapore, including the renowned Chua was also contributing to this student magazines, which was remarkable. So we can see this social realist style woodblock prints were commonly featured in their publications. So they strongly reflected the socialist fervor of that time. And this is actually the dominant culture taste and ideological leanings of a generation, of the 1950s. So because this merging of radical politics, art, and literature, it inevitably attracted the scrutiny of the colonial government. So Renjiang was banned in September 1956. So we also have another group of literary communities who were non-leftists, right? So one of which, even though leftist ideology was a driving force behind the anti-yellow culture movement, but there are also voices from the other camp who didn't really fully align with the movement, but they also in a way support the movement because the movement was so big and dominant. So one of these non-leftists is Yao Zi, the author who also edited 文艺行列 in 1950. So at the height of the movement, students were they were really enthusiastic. So the campaign anti-yellow culture movement, the campaign actually took a confrontational tone. So it created clear divisions between the supporters and the opponents. So Yao Zi is one of them who were being targeted as being the so-called yellow writer, even though Yao Zi himself said that he supported the movement. So his books and his magazines were labeled as yellow or pornographic. But in particular, this article, this short story that he wrote called Orang Lari, and it featured kind of a naked women's illustration. And very quickly, the leftist students in one of the 4 magazines that I mentioned, they very quickly attacked Yao Zi for being writing pornographic stuff. And the students and individuals in the middle schools who helped sell or circulate Yao Zi's magazine, Wen Yibao, were also targeted by other students too. But Wen Yibao was hugely popular during that time because it was purely literary, and Yao Zi is a well-known writer. He's a popular writer, also a serious writer. So, but I also won't go into detail about Wen Yibao. But a point that I want to make is that even a non-leftist magazine was not immune from the colonial government scrutiny, because Yao Zi was arrested on September the 5th, 1954, under emergency law. So his house was searched by a special branch, and he was released 3 days later. He was not charged. But Wen Yibao Literary Post was very soon to be suspended from publication. So managed to bring out only about 16 issues because of the highly restricted political and financial circumstances. So the other group of the non-leftists is the Jiaofeng group. So this is another key development during this time because of the arrival of intellectuals associated with the so-called third force from Hong Kong, who were connected to the Hong Kong Union publisher. So these individuals, they played an important role in establishing Jiaofeng magazines in 1955 in Singapore, which became a significant literary publication that continues to be published until today. So Jiaofeng has a distinction. It holds the prestige of being Malaysia's longest running literary magazine. So Its influence is particularly notable for championing modernist literature, which introduced new literary expressions to the region, heavily influenced by Taiwanese modernism. So in its formative years, in an early period, it received financial backing from the Asia Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization funded by the US Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. And this financial support, was part of a larger Cold War strategy of the US aiming at countering communist influence in Southeast Asia by promoting so-called creative freedom, as opposed to those tied to socialist ideology. So if you look at the previous slides, those were the dominant kind of magazines during that time, of no financial support from elsewhere. The students were kind of running these things by themselves, and they were targeted. And then comes Jiaofeng, which has a strong financial backing, but only in the early stage. So because of the financial assistance, which allowed Jiaofeng to thrive in a highly competitive literary landscape, where the leftist realist ideologies were dominant, and so it ensures their kind of presence and impact in Mahua literature. So in recent years, of course, scholars have increasingly explored Jiaofeng's US-backed origins during the Cold War. Scholars raise questions about the extent to which its editors maintain autonomy in shaping the magazine's literary directions and ideals. However, I think it would be reductive to dismiss Jiaofeng and its contributor as merely right-wing intellectuals focusing on superficial or only a superficial or 风花雪月 kind of themes. 风花雪月 means like wind, flowers, snow, and moon, which is a common term to dismiss these writers for writing escapist, romanticized, works, to contrast it with the more serious, healthy, politically charged, socially conscious literature. But nevertheless, I think the magazine played an important role in establishing modernism as a dominant and enduring literary technique among Mahua writers, especially at a time when social realism was the kind of the prevailing ideology. So towards late 60s, around 67 or 68, and Jiaofeng also experimented with some avant-garde kind of innovation. As you can see from the covers on the right side, it was designed by Tan Sui Hian, the important artist of Singapore today, who was an avant-garde kind of artist and writer. He was also a well-known poet who published in Jiaofeng, and then he joined the editorial group after that. So, but if we compare Jiaofeng with the earlier magazine that I mentioned, Jiaofeng maintained a relatively conservative stance in terms of politics. So they deliberately distanced themselves from the political discourse. So purely literary, they focus only on literature, but not, yeah. And then, but this approach actually allowed them to have a safe space. So, which means that they can continue to publish and be influential. And after the independence of Malaya, they also moved to Kuala Lumpur, and KL gradually became a cultural capital for literary activities, cultural activities, complementing the role previously played by Singapore and Penang. And the intellectuals behind Jiaofeng, at the same time, they also recognize the importance of mobilizing the young people, the literary-minded young people across Malaya. So this vision was materialized in May 1962 with the creation of 3 literary magazines in Muar, KL, and Penang, which is which is the new tide. I couldn't find a cover, Wastelands and Haitian Monthly. It's called Wasteland, as you know, it's inspired by T.S. Eliot. And So these magazines, they were edited and managed by young literary enthusiasts in their respective region across Malaya. So they are also quite short-lived, but with the support of Jiaofeng's and the intellectuals, so they managed to publish for a few years, and also highlights that they are locations outside Singapore, and they are centers of cultural and intellectual activities among the young people. So they are kind of a different group, a newer group of educated youth in Malaysia compared to the one in Singapore in 1950s. So the Cold War polemics between the so-called left and right camps became more pronounced in mid-60s, influenced by the Chinese Cultural Revolution and global geopolitical dynamics. In Malaya, a strong division developed between the two major literary camps. One is the Jiaofeng camp, which championed literary modernism, and we still have the leftist realist camp, represented by magazines such as Langhua, which was published in KL, and Pudu Manli, published in Pudu in KL. This example is as one of the issues from Langhua in 1967, as you know, at the height of Cultural Revolution, and this article declared we should hold high the banner of realism, eliminating the dark line of modernism. So 高举现实主义大旗，搞掉现代主义黑线。So they use strongly politically charged language and referring the modernist writer as 毒草, poisonous weed, and condemning the writers as 牛鬼蛇神, right? Demons and snake spirits. And these are all some familiar languages from cultural revolutions. So on the other hand, so authors in Jiaofeng also fiercely kind of promoted modernism. So these two camps were often in debates and polemics. One of the authors from Jiaofeng who kind of suffered that attack was Liu Cheng, who recently published an interesting kind of a memoir called Leaving the Fishing Village Behind. He is now a renowned scholar in Taiwan. He was from Penang. So he was known as Li Cang during that day. He was young, only I think 18 years old, something. So he wrote a few articles challenging the leftist camp in Langhua and defending modernism. So this ideological divide between the realist and modernist camp became more strengthened and entrenched because of the Cold War situation, the cultural dynamics around the globe. So the rivalry was just intellectual, but of course it's highly politically charged, as each side sought to delegitimize the other. So for the socialist realists, literature was seen as a tool to advance political causes, particularly revolutionary ones, while the modernists positioned themselves as defender of pure literature, advocating for creative freedom and intellectual independence. So the conflict was kind of less about literary merits of each camp, but more about asserting ideological dominance in a highly charged political environment. So I will quickly conclude right now. So firstly, literary magazines are not just textual artifacts, but sites of labor, creativity, and community building, fostering non-elite amateurist literary networks across Malaya and beyond. Second, I try to argue that there is this emergence of a new social class in post-war Malaya which created the need for this vibrant literary magazines. So the rising social group in the 50s were the educated, non-elite educated youth, mostly who benefited from education at Chinese medium schools across Malaya. So in the 50s was the Singaporean based students, and in the 60s were all over Malaya. And unlike books and newspapers, which require kind of professional publishers and presses, the literary magazines of this period were primarily the work of amateur teams. Very few had institutional support, Jiaofeng being the exception, right? So I feel like these magazines, they serve the broader interests of the rising class, rising social class, the young people of Malaya who lived under intense political scrutiny, but had opinions and literary dreams to express. So lastly, the Cultural Cold War, Malayan Emergency, and decolonisation shaped the debates during that time before 1969. So there were all these debates about how do we really write autonomous, a free Mahua literature. But the focus kind of shift towards Chinese identity after 1969. As many of you would know, the racial riot that happened in Kuala Lumpur creates a new kind of cultural and social atmosphere, which a lot of these magazines were not allowed to be published. And some of the groups, for example, the Jiaofeng group, they do have small kind of a subgroups among them, which were the students groups. So they were not allowed to get together again after 69. So that kind of stopped them from forming the kind of literary networks that I was trying to show, that was so vibrant from the 40s to late 60s. So I think I'll end here and appreciate any feedback or comments. Thank you.